from the college by the lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I wish to welcome all of our viewers back for our continuing series entitled A Journey Through Time. On this particular week's episode, we wish to have a conversation with Mary Wollstonecraft. Miss Wollstonecraft lived from 1759 to 1797. Miss Wollstonecraft, we are most happy to be in your living room to engage in this interview as we take this journey through time. At the age of 19 years, Mary Wollstonecraft left home to take a position as a companion to Miss Dawson, a well-to-do widow that was living in Europe. Throughout her short life, Miss Wollstonecraft traveled throughout Europe and was most interested in political and social issues and became an author, a writer. Among her works was her first book that was entitled Thoughts on the Education of Daughters in 1786. Her first novel was entitled Mary, a Fiction. She's probably best known for her works A Vindication of the Rights of Men and also her publication A Vindication of the Rights of Women. On the issue of vindication, it has been recognized as a classic in the literature as well as women's rights and issues and a social analysis as well. Ms. Wollstonecraft, thank you for being with us and allowing us this interview as we're doing this 12-week series on famous people in history.
You're quite welcome. I'm charmed to have you here.
And for our viewers, I would like to also announce that Miss Wollstonecraft is being portrayed by Dr. Virginia Tinsley Johnson, who chairs the Division of English at North Idaho College. She holds a doctorate in arts in English from Idaho State University. She's received many awards, including the very prestigious William H. Murdy Memorial Teacher of the Year Award from the Association of Community Colleges in the United States of Trustees, and that was received in 1987. With that, I'm very happy to welcome to visit in the 1700s with Miss Wollstonecraft two of my friends and panel members, Chanel Burke and Steve Shink, and we shall ask Chanel to commence the conversation with Mary Wollstonecraft.
Ms. Wollstonecraft, how do you prefer to be addressed?
Mrs. Wollstonecraft, actually, or Mrs. Godwin, if you wish. I was married to William Godwin, so I am Miss Godwin. But if you're more comfortable, Miss Wollstonecraft is just fine.
But you don't go by Mary?
To my good friends, yes, I am Mary.
And can you tell us something about how people view you? In your opinion, do you think people see you as a demure, quiet lady? Or are you somewhat more outspoken on issues?
I believe that you would call me quite outspoken, as a matter of fact. That aged, poor-witted man, Horace Walpole, in fact, when my work, Vindication of the Rights of Women, was published, referred to me as a hyena in petticoats. I've also been called an unsexed female, and of course, someone who should be banished from the female gender.
What kinds of things did you do to provoke such name calling?
Well, I actually took on some of the finest political thinkers in my time, Edmund Burke being one of them, who had the gall to defend the aristocracy during the French Revolution, and I found his ideas pure nonsense, and so I spoke out against them. And then, of course, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, with whom I had a great deal in common in some of our thoughts, but his ideas on the education of girls just set my skin on edge. And when I spoke out, then it offended some people.
Now, women in your day oftentimes took pseudonyms to write, did they not?
That's correct. In fact, when I wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Men, which was my response to Edmund Burke, I published under no name, anonymously. And then when I published the second publication, because it was so popular, in fact, some men argued that it could not have been written by a woman, that it was a man parading as a woman. And there was a great deal of animosity toward women writers, yes.
Steve Shink.
Well, I like that general topic about your books, and I want to get back to it. But before we do, Miss Wollstonecraft, there's a certain rhythm to that you have to get into. I'd like to talk a little bit more about your background. Could you tell us where you're from, the kind of education that you had, and what other experiences you had before you became a writer?
Well, I had a very limited education. I was the second of 7 children. My older brother, Ned, the family favorite, inherited through the law of primogeniture, against which I spoke firmly again and again, and of course against Edmund Burke on this one, inherited what little wealth we had. My grandfather was a weaver, and so my father, who was a drunk and abused my mother severely. In fact, I had to lie in front of their bedroom door many a night because I feared for her life. He was a wastrel, was my father. He aspired to be a gentleman farmer and wasted a great deal of the family fortune. But what was left sent Ned to law school and left the rest of us indigent. And in fact, I did support my father in his older age, despite his rough treatment of me and my mother, and my sisters and my younger brothers through my writing. My education, as I said, was minimal. Until I was about 12, I stayed at home and my mother taught me to read. And then I went to day schools until I was about 16. I did learn some basic mathematics, a smattering of French, some dancing, a little geography and history. But most of my learning I acquired on my own, through my own reading. I am passionately in love with books. And through the sponsorship of my mentor, Mr. Johnson, who was my publisher, he encouraged me to learn both French and German so that I could translate. And it was through his mentoring, as I say, that I did get into the business of writing through my books. And he hired me to be a reviewer for books in an analytical review in London, which is where I was from after moving around and returned there, to answer that question. And he also published my novels and my books on thoughts on educating young girls.
Oh, wonderful. That leads me right into my next couple of quick questions, I hope, Tony. Would you say then that it was your love of reading and maybe the technical benefit of being an analytic reviewer that taught you how to write well?
I believe so. It's just the practice of writing. I had no formal instruction in writing, but I had a good mentor in Mr. Johnson, Joseph Johnson, and also I was part of a literary circle of very famous people, as I've come to learn. And among my admirers when they were younger were Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth. William Blake, also a famous romantic writer and artist, illustrated one of my books on the education of true stories from real life. And also Thomas Paine is one of my acquaintances whom I met when I was in France during the French Revolution. So I actually was the only woman in this literary circle.
And a final follow-up question. If it weren't for your business association with Mr. Johnson, as a woman in 18th century England, would it have been difficult for you to be published?
Yes, I believe it would have. There were a couple of women in France. In fact, the women in the French Revolution were fairly well organized, and there were some of them who wrote. But in England, it was rare. There were women who wrote romantic novels, which I think are just terrible guides for young women, as a matter of fact. But it was through his mentorship, yes, that I was able to publish. In fact, I consider myself a new genus. I am a woman who made my living through writing. And even though there were novelists at about the same time, their families supported them. I had no support.
Mrs. Wollstonecraft, we're visiting with you in 1796. We're in your home. And as we look at your life, you have published all of those wonderful writings that I indicated as we came into your home at the beginning of the program. I'd like to lead you into some of your work by having you to tell us about this really quite aggressive conflict that you had with Mr. Russo. Certainly people in the 1700s and in future generations will read a lot about Russo, and he's in your time and later will be given lots of credit for talking about ideas that we call democratic principles. But we know from looking at his works that he was not friendly to women's issues and the women's rights. Could you take us into some things that he did that so upset you? And then I would love for you to, with my visitors here, to read from your own works about how you countered what he did.
Well, Mr. Russo is a strange man, very sensitive and sensible, and he and I agree on a great number of things, on equality and so forth. One of the things I said about him is that he maintained that he knew when things were right in the beginning, and a whole crew of writers were comparing their works and saying they knew what was right now and I knew what was right in the future, what was going to be right. The place where we separated mostly was on his ideas about the treatment of women. As you said, his ideas about political justice and equality have been firmly entrenched, and people sing his praises to the sky. I guess you might say, I'm asking, where's my revolution as a woman? He wrote about the revolution of mankind, but did not include women. And I'd be delighted to read to you some of the passages that just have really set me off, and in fact were one of the major reasons for my writing, The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Perhaps you're familiar with one of his most famous books, Emile, which is meant to be a sort of idealistic book on how to raise men. And I want you to understand what he has to say about women. And so please bear with me while I read a couple of passages about what he said about women. Oh dear.
I know this is difficult for you.
It is. My passion rises when I read these. Woman was made specially to please man. If the latter must please her in turn, it is a less direct necessity. His merit consists in his strength. He pleases by that fact alone. Her strength lies in her charms. The distinguishing marks of the sex ought to be respected as nature's ornament. He feels that women ought to be an ornament. Well, I wrote in direct contrast to that, of course, this is what he thinks, that women should be the toy, the trinket, the little tingling bell, that if women want to entertain and respond when men wish, then that is woman's job. He also believed that women should be restrained from the time they are small children. They shouldn't be, he says, do not suffer them to be free from restraint a single moment of their lives. That women will need to be restrained as they are mature adults, and so they need to learn from childhood, babyhood. Well, I strongly disagreed with that. I was a firm believer in exercise for young women. In fact, I proposed a national education plan for young people, and one of the things that I proposed is that there ought to be a large schoolyard where young people could exercise and gain bodily strength and, of course, mental strength along with that. But Rousseau's nonsense and his ideas, why, he was just in love with this fool of a woman, his wife Teresa, and because he could not bring her up to the common level of women, he tried to bring all the women down to her level. And that's just what I had to speak out against, you see.
Would you like to quote any particular thing that you had to say about your response? Well, because you did do a lot of writing in which you responded to what you have just quoted.
Yes, I certainly did. Well, I suppose I could just brush all of them together. The French, you see, I really believed that he, along with all the French, were really not probably the proper people to have undergone the revolution. I wrote here in my moral view of the French Revolution, about which I wrote a history. Unfortunately, I was pregnant during the time I wrote this and had planned a second volume and didn't get back to it. I said the French were in some respects the most unqualified of any people in Europe to undertake the important work for which they had embarked. And you see, that was because their idea of being distinguishable was that they could dance and smile and eat properly and have gay repartee. And I felt that that was just foolishness. And of course, Rousseau was right there with them. But he really angered me most, I believe, about the necessity of keeping women repressed. And the notion that if they are repressed and held back, that they will make good wives and mothers. And I argued, I think quite brilliantly, that unless women use their reason and their understanding, they could be not good wives, mothers, or good citizens. You see, his arguments for male citizens did not extend to women. And I just felt that women should be useful and that they should be good citizens as well. And so those were some of the key issues about which we disagreed.
Thank you, Janelle Burke.
Well, you've spoken very eloquently about some ideas that people will admire for years and years to come, I'm sure. But tell me about your daughters. You have some children, and
Yes.
How do you feel about them?
Well, I had two daughters, in fact, my wonderful Fannykins. Fannykins was the result of a liaison that I had when I was in France. You see, I went to France to see firsthand the French Revolution and to improve my French. I was becoming quite adept at reading French, but my speaking was not very fluent. And while I was there, I, of course, met really fascinating people. One of them was a man named Gilbert Imlay, who was an American. He was a veteran of the American Revolution, and tall and slender and sensual and exciting. And he was there because he was trying to persuade the French to invade Louisiana and to take it from Spain. Didn't do very well, but he was also a tradesman and was trading in silver and munitions and so forth. And he and I carried on a liaison, and the result of that was my daughter Fanny. And she was just the joy of my life. It was through her that I was able to live exactly some of the ideals which I had set forth regarding nursing one's own children. There was a really abominable practice of wealthy women hiring wet nurses, you see, and these young girls who would come in from the country where venereal disease was just rampant and endanger the lives of their small children. And so I did nurse my own child, Fanny. And it was with Fanny and her nurse, Marguerite, that I then traveled to Scandinavia, doing some business for Gilbert later on. That was after my first unfortunate attempt at suicide. I discovered that he was being unfaithful to me, and so I resorted to an overdose of laudanum, and he did find me in time and then sent me off to do his business in Scandinavia for a while. When I returned, I found, by the way, that he was unfaithful again, and this time I tried to make a good job of it. I paced back and forth in the rainy night and jumped into the Thames. There were, I guess you would say fortunately, some boatmen who were patrolling the Thames because many people did try to commit suicide in these terrible times. And they saved me. And I came to my senses. I finally was shut of Gilbert Imlay and fell in love with William Godwin, whom I had met earlier in this circle of intellectuals. And he and I, as he said later, just had friendship that melted into love. We both really strongly believed that marriage was the worst kind of property ownership, and that neither of us believed in it. But after all, I did have one daughter who had no father, and a second child, I knew it was a boy on the way, little Willie, and so we did marry. But we had a nice arrangement. We kept separate working quarters. We did live together, and we wrote notes back and forth. My second daughter, I died giving birth to. The placenta did not descend, and so despite efforts, I did die of that horrible fever accompanying that. And that child was raised then by William Godwin, who raised Fannykins, and she eventually married Percy Bysshe Shelley, whom you may have heard of. And the thing I'm most proud of her for is that she wrote the very famous novel Frankenstein. And there are people who say that she was working through the notion of birth and death and so forth, and through that novel. 1816 was the year that she wrote that, in fact, that she married Shelley. It was a very sad year also in that that was the year that Fanny also committed suicide, my older daughter. And I was really disappointed to learn of William Godwin's treatment there. Fanny took an overdose of laudanum also and had written a suicide note. Percy Shelley found the note, and the name was torn off, but they could tell from the circumstances, and that she had written a note also to my daughter Mary Shelley, and that she was identified by the stays in her corset, which were had the initials M.W., Mary Wollstonecraft. They were my corsets that she had on, and that William Godwin did not want to claim the body. He felt there was so much bad news in the family already, what with Mary Shelley having really run off with Percy Bysshe and his wife drowning herself in the Serpentine Pool in Hyde Park and so forth, that there was enough scandal. And so she was buried in a pauper's grave, was my Fannykins.
Steve.
That's a sad story, and it sounds as though your life was not an easy one. What was it like to be such a controversial person? Was that difficult for you?
Absolutely not. I felt myself surrounded by friends, by intellectual people who encouraged me. The hardest part of my life, I believe, was probably my personal life with Gilbert. I could not understand why he would spurn me and turn from me to these strolling actresses who's uneducated young women, and would not respond to my letters. He left me in Paris, when I was pregnant, and went to Le Havre to do some trade. And I wrote to him over and over, and eventually he did invite me to come there, and I wrote, and then he was off on business again and deserted me a great deal. And so that did make life difficult. And actually, near the end of my life, I became a little more concerned about people's opinions of me. But I feel that I'm concerned about the opinions of the best of mankind, and that I rest on my own opinions.
I understand. Were there, and obviously you wrote a great deal about social and political issues, women's
Yes.
rights. Were there other areas of your life where you either held controversial views or felt strongly about some topic of the day?
Oh, I suppose that my thoughts on the education of daughters, in fact, those were brought about by my being hired in Ireland by Lady Kingsborough to take care of her 3 daughters. And as it turned out, she became very jealous of me because I believed in letting the girls romp and play and teaching them to read and to write and some foreign languages. And Lady Kingsborough was not interested in a governess who had that kind of intellectual power. She was more interested in her huge dogs that she let sleep on the bed and eat at the table. And particularly with her older daughter, Margaret, I was a good friend. And she fired me. I also was not probably very popular with Mrs. Dawson. That was my first job as a ladies' companion with her in Bath. And I just found the women there just frivolous. They spent their days worrying about what they should wear and powdering their hair, these horrible colors of blue and red and pink, and just totally innocuous conversations. And so she wasn't very pleased with me either.
What occupations? I mean, we talked about domestic service because you tried that briefly. Luckily, you have your talent as a writer. But what occupations are there available to women like you in 18th century England?
Sadly, not many. And in fact, that was one of my reasons for writing The Vindication of the Rights of Woman and arguing so vehemently for education of women. I believe I tried the ones that were tasteful to me. That was being a lady's companion, being a governess. I don't believe I told you about my experience in teaching. My good friend Fanny Blood, my 2 sisters, and I did have a school in London for a while. It didn't work very well because I had to go to Portugal when Fanny married and moved there and had a baby and died in childbirth. And I came back and discovered my 2 sisters were really not mentally prepared to hold up the school. So I tried teaching. And then prostitution, really, and I consider marriage more or less legal prostitution, are the only avenues open to women. And hence the need for an education to give them more opportunities. I believe women should be allowed to be doctors and lawyers and, heavens, even have their own representation in government.
Mary Wollstonecraft, as we're interviewing you here in 1796, you have visited France, as you indicated. You were very, very interested in the French Revolution, and as a person that had great advocacy for both women and men, and you were a pioneer in your day. You became somewhat disillusioned, though, did you not, when you saw the results? Would you share with us
Yes.
your concerns?
I did. It is one thing to think ideally of the rights of man and of woman, and to be concerned about the evils of property. And I saw the French Revolution really founded on the evils of property and of primogeniture and of tyranny. And to see people held back and restrained, as I later wrote in both Vindication of the Rights of Woman and Man, deeply offended me. However, I was witness when Louis XVI was taken to trial. And it was a powerful sight to see this once dignified and noble human being being led off to trial. And to see the actuality of the murders that went on. At one point I did see where a person had just been beheaded by a guillotine, and the pool of blood there on the sidewalk deeply affected me. And in fact, I began to weep and to rage, and was carried off by a friend who warned me that I must be silent. This was the beginning of the Terror and Robespierre. And in fact, just before England and France got into war, and so my own life was in danger because I was a British citizen. And that was when I must admit that Gilbert Imlay and I did set ourselves up as being man and wife, and we went to the American embassy and said we were married, and that was to protect me under his American citizenship. But the horrors of the excesses of the French Revolution, I believe, were far more than I could have anticipated in envisioning, trying to envision the rights that were being defended there. Excess of power, weak men and power and tyranny seem to be a pattern throughout history.
In your time, you are traveling a lot, as we've indicated, and it's not easy to travel. Tell us how you traveled, because you really moved around through Europe, and what mode of travel did you do?
Yes, I did. As I said, Gilbert, I presume people might say, to get me out of the country, sent me off, but it indicated his trust in my abilities, I believe, to be his agent in Scandinavia. He had a load of silver that he was bringing in, and he also dealt in alum and soap and other needs that the French people needed during their revolution. And I traveled by boat primarily and was responsible for my own arrangements. I had some letters of introduction from Gilbert to a few tradesmen there in Sweden and Norway and in Denmark. And then by carriage, whenever I could make arrangements. And I was traveling with Fanny, who was about a year old, and this French nurse, Marguerite. There were times when I worried about their safety, so I traveled by myself. And I did see some incredible sights there. I saw the poor Swedish women, no better off than any British or French women, washing their clothes down in the stream and the ice with bare feet, and the men not deigning to even carry a bucket of water for them.
You were very courageous, not only in your writings, but in your travel. You were a really strong individual. Also, you had some language barriers, did you not, as you traveled?
Oh, I certainly did. As I explained to you, I had gone earlier to France to improve my French, and in traveling in Scandinavia, I knew no Scandinavian languages. And I was pleased to find in Sweden a young man who spoke French so that we could communicate, but it was very difficult communicating.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I have to say that we're out of time in visiting with you today. Mary Wollstonecraft, thank you for sharing your life and your works with us.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll join us again next week when we will continue our journey through time, and we'll interview and have a conversation with yet another famous person in history. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.